Welcome. In this video, we will continue looking at the Middle Ages. Last time, we left off by discussing one of the central ideas of the Middle Ages, which is feudalism, this social, economic, and political system, an all-encompassing way of life of Europeans under feudalism during the Middle Ages, this 1,000-year period from roughly 500 to 1500 AD. Our next topic is the central role of the Catholic Church in Europe during the medieval period. And while our next unit on the Reformation will jump into this much more, I want to hit a few highlights, particularly from the ancient and medieval world. The church is central to feudalism. It's, after all, the first estate of the three estates. It is a central part. Bishops and priests play a key role in the social system of life in the Middle Ages in Europe. What are some of the key events in our timeline of the church in ancient into the medieval period? Remember, in 313, Constantinople marks a split in the Roman Empire, that legally there is an Eastern Empire capitaled at Constantinople on the Bosporus Strait, and in the west, here's Constantinople, and then in the west you had Rome in Italy. This might be a little better picture there, the two halves of the empire. Well, you had the fall of the western half of the empire, 476. In 800, Charlemagne is crowned. But just looking ahead, it's not until 1453 that Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, and the old eastern half of the Roman Empire lasts 1,000 years longer than the western Latin-speaking Roman half. The Eastern Greek Roman Empire lasts until 1453. Two major events in the life of the church itself is the Great Schism. The Great Schism in 1054 is a major split between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And so you see the split between the Orthodox and the Catholic that still lasts to this day. There were some theological, but also some political conflict that led to this split. Most of the teachings, understandings of authority in the church did not change or have major difference, but it was enough to lead to an irreconcilable split between the Catholic and the Orthodox Christians. Another major event in the Middle Ages and life of the church happened in 1077, when a Holy Roman Emperor named Henry tried to invest the bishops of his own choosing. And this was forbidden by the Pope and by canon law. This was against canon law. Again, to our diagram of feudalism, church affairs, such as choosing a bishop, was meant to be the realm of the Pope. And here was a king or emperor sort of crossing the streams, if you will, and trying to have a say on who the bishops were. Well, the Pope told him not to do it. He did it. The Pope condemned it. He stood by it. And so the Pope excommunicated the king and forbade him from receiving the sacraments. He replaced him under interdict. He could not go to Mass. He could not receive any of the other sacraments. And the king tried to stand up to him, but all of the other church officials stood with the Pope, and the king began to lose the respect of his own people, his own lords, and then other kings said, well, if you're not in good standing with the church, we don't have to honor you either. And King Henry found himself in a terrible way, and he was forced to do what's called go to Canossa. The Pope happened to be staying at a place in northern Italy called Canossa. This is a frieze. This is an image of that, of a king who walked around the castle in the snow bareheaded 3 times. He circled the castle and was admitted to the presence of the Pope and had to sort of grovel and beg forgiveness. And so we use that phrase, like the road to Canossa or going to Canossa, to refer to any time you have to grovel for forgiveness in a way that is sort of beneath your dignity. Now, that king did get his revenge, because I believe it was not that far into the future that he actually sent an army and imprisoned the Pope and sort of got his revenge. And so, as we saw in our diagram here, the church and the state, the Pope and kings, were often kind of in a major political power struggle at various times in the Middle Ages. And so that tended to play out in a variety of ways. Lastly, on the Middle Ages, we've talked about the political social structure, we've talked about the church. Let's talk briefly about trade. Trade was very few and far between. During the old Roman days, there was a lot of trade, but not so much in the Middle Ages. The most common things that were traded were things like spices, silk, porcelain, things that are from a different area of the world, that are not native to your region. You don't trade with someone when you both have the same thing. You trade when you have different resources. And geographic diversity leads to a diversity of resources. There's a different climate, different crops, different technology, different mineral resources. And so there's often a desire to trade with people on very far reaches of the world. Why would people engage in it, even though it was very dangerous? Is that there were massive profits to be had. But really, in this time period, only the really rich can engage in much trade and purchasing things beyond their home. Remember, most people are engaged in what we call the manorial system, where you have the manor house, and most peasants rarely leave the land, rarely leave the area where they grew up. They farm the dirt, and they mostly use and consume things that they themselves personally made, or people known to them personally made. Things that are traded from a far distance are really only obtainable by the quite wealthy. What interactions? Who plays a role in trade? Well, because in this early and into the middle of the Middle Ages, you had these barbarians, that people in between great civilizations in India, East Africa, China, Southern Europe, it was hard to trade, because there were people who found it easier to raid other civilizations rather than grow food and build a civilization themselves. And so it's very dangerous, because there are large groups of uncivilized people who will raid your caravans and raid your trade and ships. There's little trade because of the manorial system. As we just said, people grow what they need themselves. Who engages in trade? Well, the Europeans themselves engage in very little of it. That'll be a major theme when we get to the exploration period, as Europeans want to take ownership of their own trade resources. So we'll get into a future day about Columbus. But in this time, the Italian city-states, most notably the Venetians from Venice, and the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim Turks and Arabs and East African peoples are really dominant in trade with not only themselves, but trade between Europe and India and China and all these other places. And it's one of the major factors leading Europeans in a later age to sponsor voyages directly to other parts of the world, because there is this high demand for things. Only the rich can really have it. And there are these other groups in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East that really control the trade routes and yield much of the profit, cutting out many of the Europeans. And lastly, the Weltanschauung of the Middle Ages. That's a German word that roughly corresponds to worldview, like how you see the world. It can kind of encompass religion, but it can also be more than that. It's your world view, the Weltanschauung, how you look at human beings' place in the world, a value system, if you will. And I make the argument that one of the clearest differences between a medieval world and the Renaissance world is hard to pin down, and in a way is one of a difference in Weltanschauung, of the way that they saw the world. That was a key change. That in the Middle Ages, I'm going to use the acronym FACT, F-A-C-T, faith, authority, collectivity, tradition, were key core values of the medieval world. And that the Renaissance values crushed those FACT values. And we'll look at those coming up soon. I have them right here. The classicism rulers, universal man, skepticism, humanism were all Renaissance values. What values do we hold dear today? A common way, not to get into it too specifically, but a common theme among many people today, contemporary times, is this idea of that's very post-modern, a sort of UBU, a sort of a unwillingness to define truth, and unwillingness to condemn other people or state bold truth claims. That's a very common modern value today, for good and for worse. And if we were in class, I would have us sort of discuss our interpretation of that, but it's not really part of the scope of the class as far as what I'm including today. So let's talk about what this Weltanschauung of the Middle Ages included. Faith, authority, collectivity, tradition. F-A-C-T, fact. So faith, how do we say faith was one of their core values? Look at the cathedrals they built. Last year was very recently, I think it was 2 years ago, very tragic as the Notre Dame Cathedral burned. And these cathedrals that took 100 years to build and people really got behind. And fathers and their sons and their grandsons then would end up working on these massive churches when everything else was relatively poor and people were very poor. These communities really poured their heart and soul into building these beautiful, long-lasting cathedrals. You look at the Crusades. Well, again, another major undertaking of the peoples of Europe in the Middle Ages was to open the pathway to the Holy Land so that pilgrims could go on pilgrimage to visit the holy places during the life from the life of Christ and featured in the Bible. That was a major investment of people in the Middle Ages. And a general focus on the afterlife. Life was hard. Life was short. And the idea was avoid sin, have faith in God, have focus on achieving equality, justice, happiness with God in the afterlife in heaven, and avoiding hell rather than an overburdened focus on enjoying this life on earth. Authority, and belief and a sense in trusting authority, that you had loyalty to those above you. You had duties to those above you. Just a confidence in the authority of the church, a confidence in the authority of kings, confidence in the authority of lords and nobles. This sense that there were 3 estates in life. The first estate, those who pray, the clergy, the bishops, the priests. Those who fight, the nobles, the knights, the lords. They are the warrior leaders. And those who work, the peasants, the everyone else. And that you have your place and that you listen to those above you. And that was a core value. Nowadays, we kind of say question authority, question the man. What we always want to seem to be challenging authority, and that is a very contrast, that is in quite contrast to the values of the Middle Ages. The value of collectivity, the sense of your duty, not so much you be you. The attitude was you be who you're supposed to be. You fulfill your duty. It's not about you being an individual flower, snowflake, doing your little thing. It's about what you can do to support others and to not let other people down. It's not that everyone is equal, but that everyone is equal in dignity, everyone's equal as a human being, that you have a purpose and a place, and it's up to you to fulfill that place. We're all in this together. Doesn't mean we're equal, but it means everyone has a purpose. And finally, maybe most importantly, is tradition. The Middle Ages and many other eras in human history have a sense of tradition. Nowadays, we seem to love disruption and the idea that newer is better, but at this time, it is tradition. Newer is never better, rarely. Why do they think this? I think this goes back to that Roman Empire. You have a Roman Republic and you lose it, becomes an empire. You have the great Roman Empire and the Pax Romana, and the barbarians come. You have big cities and they were destroyed, and people, resorted to feudalism in the countryside. In our modern era, we can look at so much technology and say, well, this is better than what it used to be. And we sometimes think this goes into all areas. Just because technology improves doesn't necessarily mean that morals or knowledge always improves. But it does mean that in the Middle Ages, they had a strong resistance to novelty, a resistance to all things new. Next time, we'll look at how this is in direct contrast to the Weltanschauung or worldview of the Italian Renaissance. Thanks for watching.